February 14th, 1963. A date that most Americans remember for Valentine's Day cards and candy hearts. But for those who lived through the turbulent civil rights era, February 14th, 1963, should be remembered as the day America almost lost one of its most powerful voices. At exactly 2:47 that winter afternoon, Malcolm X stepped through the heavy wooden doors of the Audubon Ballroom in Manhattan, completely unaware that death was watching him through a high-powered rifle scope from a rooftop 200 yards away. The shooter, a Korean War veteran named Thomas Mitchell, had been lying motionless on that frozen rooftop for over 3 hours. His finger rested lightly on the trigger of his military-grade rifle. The crosshairs were centered perfectly on Malcolm's right temple, just below the rim of his dark fedora. One gentle squeeze, barely 2 pounds of pressure, and the most dangerous voice in Black America would be silenced forever. The bullet was chambered. The safety was off. The moment had arrived. But the shot never came. Because at that precise instant, as Malcolm X stood vulnerable in the doorway of the Audubon Ballroom, another figure appeared in Mitchell's rifle scope. A stocky, well-dressed black man in an expensive overcoat, moving with the confident stride of someone who owned the streets of Harlem, Bumpy Johnson. And what happened next? The split-second decision that saved Malcolm X's life would remain buried in classified FBI files for the next 60 years. This isn't the story you know about Malcolm X's assassination in 1965. That chaotic shooting at the same Audubon Ballroom, with its amateur gunmen and sloppy execution, has been analyzed and debated for decades. This is the story of the first attempt on Malcolm's life, the professional job that failed, the sophisticated conspiracy that was stopped by Harlem's most powerful gangster, the assassination plot that both the FBI and the killers desperately wanted erased from American history. If you lived through the early 1960s, you remember the electricity that surrounded Malcolm X whenever he spoke. You remember the way he could electrify a crowd with just a few words, the way he made even his enemies stop and listen. By 1963, Malcolm had become something that terrified powerful people in both Black and white America. He'd become unpredictable. No longer content to simply repeat Elijah Muhammad's teachings, Malcolm was beginning to think for himself, and that independent thinking was about to get him killed. To understand what happened that cold Valentine's Day afternoon in 1963, you need to understand the war that was brewing beneath the surface of Black America. It wasn't just the obvious war between civil rights activists and white supremacists. This was a more complex battle, fought in the shadows, where the lines between friend and enemy weren't always clear. Malcolm X had become the most feared voice of his generation. Not just feared by white America, though they certainly feared him, but feared by the very organization that had made him famous, the Nation of Islam. By early 1963, those who knew Malcolm X well could see the change in him. His wife Betty noticed it first, the way he would stare out their bedroom window at night, lost in thought, the way he would question things that had once seemed certain. Malcolm was pulling away from Elijah Muhammad, and anyone familiar with the Nation of Islam's history knew that people who pulled away from Muhammad didn't usually live long enough to tell their stories. The relationship between teacher and student was becoming something darker. Malcolm had discovered things about Elijah Muhammad that shattered his faith in the man he'd once called the messenger of Allah. Adultery with young secretaries in the organization. Financial corruption that diverted money meant for the poor into Muhammad's personal accounts. Lies about his divine connection and his teachings. And Malcolm X, being the man he was, wasn't the type to stay quiet about uncomfortable truths. For a man like Malcolm, raised on the streets of Boston and New York before his conversion, the hypocrisy was unbearable. He'd given up drinking, gambling, and womanizing to follow Muhammad's teachings. He'd preached discipline and moral purity to thousands of followers. Now he was learning that his spiritual father had been living the exact life that Malcolm had renounced. This created a problem that went far beyond personal disappointment. Malcolm X knew too many secrets about the Nation of Islam's operations. He had too much influence within the organization. Most dangerously, he had too many followers who would listen to him over Muhammad if it came to a choice. Malcolm's potential defection wasn't just a religious crisis, it was an existential threat to the Nation of Islam's power structure. And the Nation of Islam's solution to existential threats was simple and permanent. But here's what most Americans still don't know, even today. The Nation of Islam wasn't working alone in their desire to eliminate Malcolm X. They had help from some very unexpected allies. Federal agents who saw Malcolm as a threat to national security. Local police officers who viewed him as a potential terrorist. Politicians who worried about his growing influence on young Black Americans. These groups had very different reasons for wanting Malcolm dead, but they were perfectly willing to cooperate toward the same goal. The morning of February 14, 1963, started like any other day for Malcolm X in his modest home in Elmhurst, Queens. Those who knew Malcolm's routine could have set their watches by his habits. Up at 5:30 a.m. sharp, no matter what time he'd gone to bed. 15 minutes reading from the Quran in Arabic, his lips moving silently as he worked through the verses. Silent prayer facing east toward Mecca. His tall frame folded on the small prayer rug Betty had bought him for their anniversary. By 6:15, he was in the kitchen, making coffee strong enough to wake the dead. A habit he'd picked up during his hustling days in Boston, when staying alert could mean the difference between freedom and prison. Betty would join him around 6:30, and they'd share 20 minutes of quiet conversation before their 3 young daughters woke up and turned the house into the controlled chaos that comes with small children. That particular morning, Malcolm seemed more relaxed than usual. He played with 2-year-old Ilyasa, while Betty fed the baby, making silly faces that sent his daughter into fits of giggling. He helped 6-year-old Atala with her spelling homework, patiently sounding out difficult words. For a few precious minutes he wasn't the fiery minister who terrified white America or the intellectual revolutionary who was pulling away from the Nation of Islam. He was just a father enjoying breakfast with his family. But even in these quiet moments, Betty could see the weight he was carrying. The way his jaw tightened when he thought she wasn't looking. The way his eyes would drift to the window, scanning the street out of habit. Malcolm X, in 1963, was a man who had learned that danger could come from any direction, at any time. At 8:45 a.m., Malcolm kissed Betty goodbye, a longer kiss than usual she would remember later. He hugged each of his daughters, telling them to be good for their mother and promising to bring them something special when he came home. Then he walked to his car, a modest Ford sedan that he'd chosen specifically because it wouldn't attract attention, and began the drive into Manhattan that would nearly cost him his life. Malcolm's first meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. at Columbia University, in a small conference room in the philosophy department. The group waiting for him represented something new and potentially dangerous in American civil rights. Young Black intellectuals who were growing frustrated with the nonviolent approach championed by Martin Luther King Jr. These were college students and recent graduates, many from middle-class families who were beginning to question whether peaceful resistance could ever truly challenge the systemic racism that defined American society. The meeting was organized by a 22-year-old graduate student named Robert Williams, not the famous Robert F. Williams, who advocated armed self-defense, but a different young man with the same revolutionary spirit. Williams had been following Malcolm's speeches and writings for months, and he believed that Malcolm represented the future of Black liberation in America, militant, uncompromising, and willing to confront white supremacy with intellectual clarity rather than moral appeals. When Malcolm walked into that Columbia conference room, he found 15 young faces looking at him with the kind of intense hope that both inspired and terrified him. These weren't the street hustlers or prison converts who typically made up his audiences. These were educated, articulate, ambitious young people who could potentially become the leaders of a new kind of civil rights movement. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours, and by all accounts, it exceeded everyone's expectations. Malcolm spoke about the limitations of integration as a goal, arguing that true equality required Black economic independence and cultural pride. He talked about the international context of the American civil rights struggle, connecting it to anti-colonial movements in Africa and Asia. Most importantly, he shared his growing belief that the civil rights movement needed to become more political, more strategic, and more willing to challenge not just segregation but the entire economic system that kept Black Americans in poverty. The students were electrified. They asked penetrating questions about tactics and strategy. They challenged some of Malcolm's assumptions about white people and integration. They pushed him to think more deeply about how to build a mass movement among Black Americans who weren't necessarily ready for the Nation of Islam's religious message. By the time the meeting ended at 11:50 a.m., Malcolm was energized in a way that he hadn't felt in months. These young intellectuals had reminded him why he'd been drawn to activism in the first place, not just to preach to the converted but to reach people who could think for themselves and build something powerful, something that could challenge both white supremacy and the conservative leadership of the existing civil rights movement, something that threatened everyone who profited from keeping Black America divided and controllable. Malcolm left Columbia University, convinced that he was on the verge of building something revolutionary. As he walked across the campus toward his parked car, his mind was already working on the practical questions of organization. How to reach more young intellectuals like the ones he'd just met. How to build a movement that was both militant and sophisticated. How to break away from the Nation of Islam while maintaining the support of people who respected his spiritual journey. What Malcolm didn't know was that his every move that morning had been watched. Federal agents had photographed everyone who entered and left the Columbia meeting. They'd recorded license plate numbers and taken notes on conversations overheard in the hallways. Most ominously, they'd called ahead to Malcolm's next appointment to confirm that he would be where they expected him to be. Malcolm's second meeting was scheduled for noon at a small restaurant in Midtown Manhattan. He was planning to meet with journalists from several Black newspapers, the Amsterdam News, the Pittsburgh Courier, and Jet magazine. This wasn't unusual. Malcolm regularly spoke with Black press to get his message out to communities that mainstream white media often ignored. But this meeting was going to be different. Malcolm was planning to use this gathering to announce his break from the Nation of Islam publicly. He was going to reveal some of the corruption he'd discovered in the organization's leadership. Most dangerously, he was going to announce his intention to start his own organization, one that would be more political, more militant, and more threatening to the established order than anything Black America had seen before. The restaurant Malcolm had chosen was Tony's Italiano, a small family-owned place on West 47th Street, where the owner, Tony Marcelli, had become friendly with several civil rights leaders. Tony's wife made the best chicken parmesan in Midtown, and Tony himself was one of those white New Yorkers who genuinely supported the civil rights movement. More importantly for Malcolm's purposes, Tony's had a back room where private conversations couldn't be overheard by curious ears. But that meeting never happened. At 1:30 p.m., just as Malcolm was parking his car 3 blocks from Tony's Italiano, his phone rang. In 1963, car phones were rare and expensive, but Malcolm had invested in one because his growing schedule required constant communication with his assistants and security team. The caller identified himself as James Washington, someone from the Audubon Ballroom's management team. Malcolm recognized the name. Washington was one of the people responsible for scheduling and security when Malcolm spoke at the venue. His voice sounded urgent, almost panicked. "Brother Malcolm, we have an emergency situation here at the ballroom," Washington said. "There's been a problem with your security team, and we need you to come immediately. Some of your people are here, but they're asking for you specifically. Can you get here right away?" Malcolm should have been suspicious of that phone call. Should have asked more questions. Should have verified Washington's identity before making any decisions. But Malcolm X, in early 1963, was still relatively trusting when it came to people within the Black community. He'd spent so many years focused on the threat from white racists and law enforcement that he hadn't yet developed the deep paranoia about internal enemies that would characterize his final years. The Audubon Ballroom had always felt like safe territory to Malcolm. Located at 3940 Broadway in Washington Heights, it was a stately venue that had been hosting Black cultural events since the 1940s. The ballroom's high ceilings and elegant architecture reminded older Harlem residents of a more hopeful time when Black entertainers and speakers could command respect and attention in beautiful surroundings. Malcolm had spoken there dozens of times without incident, building a relationship with the staff and developing security procedures that had worked flawlessly. But as Malcolm drove toward the Audubon Ballroom that afternoon, canceling his meeting with the black journalists and redirecting his entire day, he was walking into the most sophisticated trap ever set for a civil rights leader in American history. The assassination plot that was unfolding around Malcolm X involved more moving parts than most people could have imagined. This wasn't the work of a few angry individuals or even a single organization. This was a coordinated effort that brought together people who normally would have been enemies, united only by their shared belief that Malcolm X needed to die before he could break away from the Nation of Islam and start something new. Thomas Mitchell, the Korean War sniper, positioned on the rooftop across from the Audubon Ballroom, represented just one piece of the puzzle. Mitchell had served with distinction in Korea, where he'd earned a reputation as one of the most accurate long-distance shooters in his regiment. After the war, he'd struggled with what we'd now recognize as post-traumatic stress, drifting from job to job and battling the kind of drinking problem that plagued many veterans of that conflict. In late 1962, Mitchell had been approached by men who promised him steady work that would use his military skills. They never told him exactly who they represented, but Mitchell understood that these were serious people with serious money and serious connections. His first assignments were simple: surveillance work, following people, and taking photographs, the kind of jobs that paid well and didn't require too many questions. But in January 1963, the nature of his work had changed. Mitchell was told that he would be asked to eliminate a target who posed a threat to national security. The pay for this assignment would be $25,000, more money than Mitchell had ever seen at one time. Enough to start over somewhere new, maybe get the help he needed for his drinking problem. Certainly enough to make him willing to kill a man he'd never met. The three backup assassins positioned inside the Audubon Ballroom represented a different type of professional entirely. These were men with connections to organized crime, people who specialized in making problems disappear quietly and permanently. James Washington, the man who had lured Malcolm to the ballroom with his phone call, was actually a low-level associate of the Genovese crime family who had been recruited for this specific job. Washington's two partners, Anthony Russo and David Coleman, had been chosen because they could blend into a crowd at a black political event without attracting attention. Russo was light-skinned enough to pass for Puerto Rican or mixed race, while Coleman was a black man from Detroit who had done similar work for organized crime figures in the Midwest. Their job was straightforward. If the sniper's shot missed, or if Malcolm managed to escape the building alive, they would finish him inside the Audubon Ballroom and make it look like an internal dispute among Malcolm's followers, rather than an assassination coordinated by outside forces. The coordination between these different elements, the federal surveillance, the organized crime connections, the Nation of Islam's internal approval, the professional planning, represented something new in American political violence. This wasn't a crime of passion or a spontaneous act of hatred. This was a business decision, carried out by people who killed for money and covered by people who killed for power. Malcolm arrived at the Audubon Ballroom at 2:30 p.m., driving his modest Ford sedan through streets that were unusually quiet for a winter afternoon in Washington Heights. As he parked the car, Malcolm noticed things that should have concerned him: the lack of people on the sidewalks, the unmarked cars parked at strategic locations, the way certain individuals seemed to be watching the building rather than going about their normal business. But Malcolm was focused on the supposed emergency involving his security team. As he walked toward the ballroom's main entrance, his mind was on practical problems. What kind of situation could have required his immediate presence? Why his security coordinator hadn't called him directly? Whether this crisis would force him to cancel his evening speech at a mosque in Brooklyn. The Audubon Ballroom's lobby was nearly empty when Malcolm entered, which immediately struck him as wrong. During the day, the building usually bustled with activity: cleaning crews preparing for evening events, office workers from the nonprofit organizations that rented space upstairs, community members who used the building for meetings and social gatherings. The silence felt unnatural, almost ominous. James Washington was waiting for Malcolm near the elevator, wearing a dark suit and a nervous expression that should have been an immediate warning sign. Washington approached Malcolm with the kind of urgent body language that suggested crisis, but his eyes wouldn't meet Malcolm's directly. "Brother Malcolm, thank you for coming so quickly," Washington said, his voice carrying a slight tremor. "Your security people are upstairs in conference room B. There's been some kind of disagreement and they specifically asked for you to mediate." Malcolm followed Washington toward the elevator. But as they walked through the lobby, he began to notice details that triggered his survival instincts. There were 3 other men in the lobby, all wearing similar dark suits, all positioned near the building's exits, rather than near the elevator or the information desk. Their body language suggested they were there to control movement rather than to conduct normal business. More disturbing, Malcolm didn't recognize any of these men. In his years of speaking at the Audubon Ballroom, he'd gotten to know most of the regular staff and many of the building's frequent visitors. These men were strangers, and their presence during what was supposed to be an internal emergency involving his security team made no sense. As the elevator doors closed, Malcolm found himself studying Washington's reflection in the polished metal. The man was sweating despite the February cold, and his hands were shaking slightly. Most telling, Washington kept glancing at his watch, as if he was working according to a specific timeline. "James," Malcolm said quietly, "what exactly happened with my security team?" Washington's answer was vague and contradictory, full of references to people Malcolm didn't recognize and situations that didn't make sense. By the time the elevator reached the 3rd floor, Malcolm X had realized that he was in serious danger. When the elevator doors opened, Malcolm saw an empty hallway that should have been filled with his people if there was really an emergency requiring his presence. Conference room B, where his security team was supposedly waiting, was dark. The whole situation had the feel of a setup, and Malcolm's street instincts, honed during his hustling days in Boston and New York, were screaming warnings. "James," Malcolm said, not moving from the elevator, "I think there's been some confusion here. Let me call my security coordinator directly." But Washington had moved to block the elevator doors, and Malcolm could see that the man's right hand was moving towards something under his suit jacket. In that moment, Malcolm X understood that the emergency was real. But he was the target, not the solution. Malcolm had 2 choices: confront Washington in the confined space of the elevator, or try to get back to the lobby where he might have more options for escape. He chose the latter, pushing past Washington and hitting the button for the ground floor. The elevator ride down seemed to take forever, with Washington growing increasingly agitated and Malcolm calculating his chances of making it out of the building alive. When the doors opened in the lobby, Malcolm stepped out quickly and found that the 3 men in dark suits had moved closer to the elevator, effectively surrounding him. Malcolm X had walked into a trap, but he was still alive, still mobile, and still thinking clearly. As he looked around the lobby, mapping escape routes and assessing threats, he made a decision that probably saved his life. Instead of trying to fight his way out, or trying to negotiate with his captors, he walked directly toward the main entrance, as if he had every right to leave. The boldness of this move caught his would-be assassins off guard. They had expected him to panic, to run, or to try to hide. They hadn't planned for a target who would simply walk toward the exit as if nothing was wrong. For a few crucial seconds, they hesitated, unsure whether to reveal their intentions or to maintain their cover. Malcolm reached the main entrance and stepped outside into the February afternoon. For a moment he felt relief at being in open space, away from the confined trap of the building's interior. But as he looked around, he realized that the real danger was just beginning. The street in front of the Audubon Ballroom was too quiet. The few pedestrians who were visible seemed to be moving with purpose rather than the random patterns of normal street life. Most ominously, Malcolm could see unmarked cars positioned at both ends of the block, creating a kill zone with limited escape routes. Malcolm stood in the doorway of the Audubon Ballroom, caught between the assassins inside the building and whatever was waiting for him on the street. He had perhaps 30 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether he lived or died. At 2:47 p.m., exactly as Malcolm X tried to process his options and plan his next move, Thomas Mitchell adjusted his rifle scope one final time. The sniper had been watching the building's entrance through his high-powered scope for the past hour, waiting for this moment. Malcolm was perfectly positioned, standing still in the doorway, with no cover between him and Mitchell's rooftop position 200 yards away. Mitchell controlled his breathing, centering the crosshairs on Malcolm's right temple, just below the brim of his dark fedora. The wind was calm, the distance was manageable, and the target was stationary. This was an easier shot than many Mitchell had made during his military service. He began the slow, steady squeeze of the trigger that would end Malcolm X's life. But as Mitchell's finger applied pressure to the trigger, something unexpected appeared in his rifle scope. A stocky, well-dressed black man in an expensive overcoat was walking directly into his line of fire. The man moved with the confident stride of someone who owned the streets, completely unaware that he was about to interfere with an assassination. Mitchell paused, waiting for the man to move out of the way so he could take his shot at Malcolm. But instead of walking past, the man stopped directly in front of Malcolm X, effectively blocking any shot from Mitchell's position. The man in the expensive overcoat was Bumpy Johnson, and his presence on that street corner was about to change the course of American history. Bumpy Johnson wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the Audubon Ballroom that Valentine's Day afternoon. As the most powerful black crime boss in Harlem, Bumpy had his own empire to manage, numbers running, loan sharking, and the complex network of legitimate and illegitimate businesses that made him one of the most influential men in New York City's black community. By 1963, Bumpy was in his 50s, a seasoned operator who had survived decades in a business where most men didn't live to see their 40th birthday. But that morning, Bumpy had received information that changed his entire day. One of his contacts in the New York Police Department, a detective named Murphy who had been on Bumpy's payroll for years, had mentioned seeing unusual activity around the Audubon Ballroom. Federal agents asking questions about Malcolm X's schedule. Unmarked surveillance cars positioned at strategic locations throughout Washington Heights. The kind of coordinated law enforcement presence that usually preceded major arrests or worse. For most people, this information would have meant staying away from the area. But Bumpy Johnson had survived as long as he had, by paying attention to patterns that other people missed. And everything he was hearing about the surveillance around Malcolm X reminded him of the preparations that preceded the assassination of other inconvenient black leaders. Bumpy's relationship with Malcolm X went back to the early 1940s, when Malcolm was still Malcolm Little, a teenage hustler running numbers and small cons in the streets of Harlem. Even then, Bumpy had recognized something special in the skinny kid from Michigan. An intelligence and intensity that set him apart from the ordinary street criminals who drifted through Harlem's underworld. When Malcolm had gotten involved with the Nation of Islam and cleaned up his life, Bumpy had watched his transformation with something approaching pride. Here was proof that even the most lost young men could find their way to something meaningful. Malcolm's evolution from street hustler to respected religious leader represented the kind of redemption story that Bumpy, despite his own criminal lifestyle, deeply appreciated. More than personal affection, though, Bumpy understood Malcolm's value to the black community in ways that many legitimate civil rights leaders did not. Malcolm represented something that couldn't be easily replaced: authentic black anger channeled into intellectual power. Malcolm spoke for the people who couldn't identify with Martin Luther King's middle-class respectability, who needed a leader who understood what it meant to come from the bottom and fight your way up. If Malcolm X was killed, Bumpy knew that voice would be lost, and the black community would be weaker for that loss. At 2:30 p.m. on February 14, 1963, Bumpy made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He called 3 of his most trusted associates, men who had been with him for years and would follow his orders without question, and told them to meet him at the Audubon Ballroom immediately. Armed, ready for trouble. Malcolm X is in danger, Bumpy told them simply. We're going to make sure nothing happens to him. Bumpy himself arrived at the scene at 2:43 p.m., driving his signature black Cadillac with the kind of calm confidence that had made him a legend in Harlem. He parked the car in a position that would block the clearest sight line from any rooftop shooter targeting the ballroom's main entrance. Not by accident, but because Bumpy's trained eye had immediately identified the most likely sniper positions in the surrounding buildings. As Bumpy stepped out of his Cadillac, he was dressed like the successful businessman he pretended to be: expensive overcoat, perfectly pressed suit, Italian leather shoes that cost more than most men earned in a month. To casual observers, he looked like just another well-to-do Harlem resident going about his daily business. but Bumpy's eyes were scanning every window, every rooftop, every shadow where danger might be hiding. Within seconds of arriving on the scene, Bumpy had identified the three men positioned near the ballroom's exits as professional killers. Their positioning was too strategic to be coincidental. Their body language too focused to suggest casual business. These men were waiting for someone specific to emerge from the building, and Bumpy knew exactly who that someone was. More importantly, Bumpy's experienced eye caught something that the assassins on the ground couldn't see. The glint of sunlight reflecting off a rifle scope on the rooftop of the apartment building across Broadway. The telltale shadow of a prone figure behind a sniper rifle. The setup for a long-distance execution that would allow the shooter to escape while the backup team cleaned up any loose ends. When Malcolm X appeared in the doorway of the Audubon Ballroom at exactly 2:47 p.m., Bumpy was ready. Thomas Mitchell, the Korean War sniper, had Malcolm centered perfectly in his rifle scope. The target was stationary, clearly visible, completely unaware of his danger. Mitchell's finger began the smooth, steady pressure on the trigger that his military training had made automatic. In 2 seconds, maybe 3, Malcolm X would be dead. But Bumpy Johnson stepped directly into Mitchell's line of fire. Not accidentally. Not coincidentally. Bumpy had calculated the angle of the sniper's position and had moved to block the shot deliberately. For 30 seconds that stretched like 30 minutes, Malcolm X stood exposed in that doorway, while Bumpy Johnson stood between him and certain death. Mitchell couldn't fire without hitting Bumpy instead of Malcolm. Couldn't adjust his position quickly enough to acquire a new sightline before Malcolm moved. Couldn't take the risk of missing and exposing the entire operation to public scrutiny. During those crucial seconds, Bumpy made his approach look completely natural. He walked directly toward Malcolm with the easy smile of an old friend encountering someone unexpectedly, his body language casual, but his positioning precise. "Malcolm, my friend," Bumpy called out in a voice loud enough to be heard by everyone in the immediate area, including the backup assassins who were now confused about whether to proceed with their mission. "What brings you to this part of town? Come, let's talk privately." Before Malcolm could respond, before he could even fully process what was happening, Bumpy had his arm around Malcolm's shoulders and was guiding him away from the building, away from the sight lines of the sniper, away from the three professional killers who were now uncertain about their next move. As they walked, Bumpy kept up a steady stream of conversation about nothing important. The weather, mutual acquaintances, business in Harlem. But his real message was in the urgency of his movements and the protective way he kept his body between Malcolm and potential threats. "Just keep walking and don't ask questions until we reach my car," Bumpy said quietly, his tone making it clear that Malcolm's life depended on following instructions without debate. Malcolm, confused but sensing the genuine danger in Bumpy's voice, allowed himself to be led to the black Cadillac. When Bumpy opened the passenger door and said, "Get in. We need to talk," Malcolm obeyed without hesitation. Bumpy drove away from the Audubon Ballroom quickly but not frantically, his movements designed to get Malcolm out of the kill zone, without attracting attention from law enforcement or from the assassins who were now scrambling to figure out what had gone wrong with their carefully planned operation. They drove in complete silence for 5 minutes, both men lost in their own thoughts. Malcolm was trying to understand what had just happened and why Bumpy Johnson had appeared at exactly the right moment to save him. Bumpy was calculating his next moves, aware that preventing Malcolm's assassination was only the beginning of a much more complex problem. Finally, Bumpy pulled into a secluded area of Central Park, near the reservoir, where they could talk without being overheard or observed. He turned off the engine, lit a cigarette, and looked directly at Malcolm with the kind of serious expression that few people ever saw from Harlem's most powerful crime boss. "They were going to kill you today," Bumpy said simply. "Professional job. Sniper on the rooftop across from the ballroom. Backup team inside the building. You walked right into it." "Malcolm?" Malcolm stared at Bumpy, processing this information with the quick intelligence that had made him such an effective speaker and organizer. "Who?" he asked quietly. "Who was going to kill me? Does it matter?" Bumpy replied. "Could have been the Nation of Islam. Could have been the FBI, could have been local police, could have been all of them working together. The point is, they didn't succeed. And now you know you're being hunted by people who have the resources and connections to plan something this sophisticated. The conversation that followed lasted nearly 3 hours, stretching well into the evening as both men shared information and perspectives that would shape their relationship for the rest of Malcolm's life. Malcolm told Bumpy about his growing disillusionment with Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, about the corruption and hypocrisy he'd discovered in the organization's leadership, about his plans to break away and start his own movement that would be more political, more international, and potentially more threatening to the established order. Bumpy shared his observations about the surveillance he'd been noticing around Malcolm and other civil rights leaders, the coordination between federal agencies and local police that suggested a systematic effort to eliminate inconvenient black voices, the way that organized crime figures were being approached by government agents who wanted help with problems they couldn't solve through official channels. Most importantly, Bumpy offered Malcolm something that no other ally could provide: protection from the kind of sophisticated assassination attempts that traditional security measures couldn't prevent. "I can't stop them from trying," Bumpy explained, "but I can make it a lot more expensive and a lot more complicated. My people know this city better than any federal agent. My contacts in law enforcement will give us advance warning about operations being planned against you. My reputation will make potential assassins think twice about taking contracts on your life." Malcolm, initially, resisted the offer. Accepting protection from a criminal organization would compromise his moral authority and potentially discredit his message. But Bumpy made a compelling argument that Malcolm would remember for the rest of his life. "Malcolm, you're fighting a war," Bumpy said. "Wars require alliances with people you might not choose as friends in peacetime. I'm not asking you to compromise your principles or change your message. I'm asking you to stay alive long enough to deliver that message to the people who need to hear it." The arrangement they worked out that evening would remain secret until both men were dead. Bumpy's organization would provide intelligence about threats against Malcolm. They would create barriers against assassination attempts through their law enforcement contacts and their street-level networks. They would use their influence to make life difficult for anyone who tried to harm Malcolm. In return, Malcolm would maintain complete deniability about the relationship. He would never acknowledge Bumpy's protection publicly. He would never be asked to modify his message or his activities based on Bumpy's advice. The protection held for nearly 2 years, until Malcolm's actual assassination at the same Audubon ballroom in February 1965. Even then, the killers were small-time criminals rather than the professional assassins who had been deployed in 1963. Even then, the assassination was chaotic and poorly planned rather than the precision operation that Bumpy had prevented. But February 14, 1963, remained the closest call, the most dangerous moment. The day that demonstrated how vulnerable even the most prominent civil rights leaders were to coordinated assassination attempts involving multiple agencies and organizations. What happened to the would-be assassins after their plan failed reveals the high-level nature of the conspiracy they'd been part of. Thomas Mitchell, the sniper, vanished from his rooftop position within minutes and was on a plane to Chicago by evening. He received $10,000 in cash and instructions to forget everything about the Malcolm X contract. Mitchell never spoke publicly about the failed assassination and died in 1987 without revealing who had hired him. James Washington, the man who had lured Malcolm to the ballroom, was found dead in his hotel room 3 days later. Officially, he died of a heart attack, though he was only 34 years old with no history of heart problems. His 2 partners left New York permanently and never returned. The FBI filed reports claiming their surveillance of Malcolm X on February 14 had detected no unusual activity or security concerns. Local police filed similar reports. It was as if the most sophisticated assassination attempt against a civil rights leader in American history had never occurred. But Bumpy Johnson remembered everything. And over the following months, each organization that had participated in the assassination plot experienced problems. Federal agents found their careers mysteriously derailed. Police officers were transferred to undesirable assignments, Nation of Islam officials came under investigation for financial irregularities. Bumpy never made explicit threats or direct accusations. But people throughout New York's law enforcement and religious communities began to understand that someone knew what had happened on February 14th and was prepared to make life very difficult for anyone who tried something similar again. The message was unmistakable. Malcolm X was under the protection of forces that could reach into government offices, police departments, and religious institutions. The kind of protection that made assassination attempts much more complicated and much more dangerous for everyone involved. This protection allowed Malcolm to live long enough to make his pilgrimage to Mecca, to moderate some of his positions on race and religion, to become the more complex and influential leader that history remembers. Without Bumpy's intervention on that Valentine's Day afternoon, Malcolm X would have died in 1963 as a relatively narrow religious nationalist. Instead, he survived to become a more universal symbol of intellectual growth and human dignity. The relationship between Bumpy Johnson and Malcolm X demonstrates that the civil rights era was more complicated than the sanitized narratives we often prefer. The survival of our most important leaders sometimes depended on protection from our most morally compromised communities. The boundary between legitimate and illegitimate power wasn't absolute when the stakes involved the life or death of voices that couldn't be replaced. On February 14, 1963, Bumpy Johnson saved Malcolm X's life. Not for money or political gain or public recognition, but because he understood that some voices are too important to lose. Some leaders are too valuable to let die. Some moments require choosing between moral purity and political necessity. The shot that was never fired. The assassination that never happened. The day that changed American history because one man was willing to step between another man and death.